Today's show is sponsored by Yafa Bay and her Spirit of Tepereth Metaphysical Marketplace, here to provide you and your naturally special gifts with guidance and support through your life's journey, providing you tools such as candles, incense, charms, jewelry, oils, crystals, and much more. Visit them at 1273 West Broad Street in Columbus, Ohio, or online at spiritoftepereth.com. You can find all our sponsors' information in the show notes on our website. Now let's start the show.
The controversial group leader in charge, ADOS, or the American Descendants of Slavery. The controversial group ADOS, or the American Descendants of the controversial group ADOS, the American Descendants of the controversial group ADOS.
Welcome to the Articles of ADOS podcast, a weekly show where we bring you undiscussed news, articles, and information important to the American descendants of slavery, our friends, and our allies. This is episode 10. Pew, 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 pew. We made it, episode 10. Maybe I could add that. I don't know. I am your host, Lisa Todd, along with my co-host,
Daud Giazon. On today's show, we will share articles from Inverse, Washington Post, Community Independent Journal, and The Guardian. Later in the show, stay tuned for our main event, where we dive into and interview the article from The Independent, Killer Mike, T.I., and Atlanta's Black Misleadership.
Personality. Peace. This week in our personality piece, I'm going to pose another question that forces us to have personalities.
Okay, what questions do you have for us this week?
What part of the protest cycle are we in now? Things have died down. There's a few protests here and there, not as much violence. We get into a cycle with these protests. They have a real predictability part of it. What part of the cycle are we in now?
As a psychology major, they very seldom talk about mass mind. And there is definite studies in that you get in master's levels, but they stay away from it purposely so that more people aren't aware how mass mind works. They usually do it in terms of tragedies. So I can't remember all the technical terms, but think of it as a tidal wave. It's come into the shore. We had the wave last 2 weeks. Now it's receding. We're in the process of receding. This is where, from our discussion last week, dealing with the attempts of co-optation to gentrification of the movement, this is where the battle begins. As we see things relaxing, this is where focused minds have a chance to capture those of like minds and those that can be allies to our particular struggle. This is where the rally for that needs to go as things begin to die down. The people that are still willing to be out there, to the people that really felt the need and desire to correct these horrible ills that plague our society, they're still waiting for someone to lead them. And it's a human need. We desire to be led, a lot of us, and someone to define how we are to get to the promised land of justice.
Yeah. And I'm seeing more and more, especially on Twitter, even I chimed in where, okay, we understand Black Lives Matter, but now what? It didn't cost you anything. It's not costing anybody anything. Nothing's changing. The policies aren't changing. Police departments claim that they're going to make change, as they claim they're going to make change after every one of these type of events. But there was something I thought about today when I thought about this question, and is that even when Martin marched along with his counterparts, when they marched, almost, not always, but a lot of the times, it followed up with a meeting with the president. It followed up with a meeting with whatever politician that they were protesting, even racist people he were meeting with. Who's meeting with Trump? We've had these riots and lootings and protestings and whatever name you want to call it. Okay, who is ready to meet with Trump?
Well, this is exactly where Yvette Carnell has been right on target with talking about how our dislike for Trump has potentially ruined our abilities to affect meaningful change in our lives. what we've allowed Trump to do, because too many of us have, and in my view, hated Trump more than we love our children. We've allowed Trump to pick and choose which blacks he's willing to listen to. And therefore, those blacks overwhelmingly do not have the collective interest at heart. And so we're in that stage now. And this goes on to the movement basis. We've permitted, because of our inactivity of nearly 60 years, to allow people, white elites like Soros, who has, we know, financed Black Lives Matter movement and allowed a certain small element of our population who have particular interests not involving the longevity of the collective as its leaders and its leadership. And therefore, what's in the minds of people during this horrible, brash time? The Soros financed group. Mm-hmm. And so it's catchy phrase. Everybody remembers it. So that becomes the go-to, along with other people that are tempted to be opportunistic during this time. Again, this is what I was talking to last week. This is our challenge. We have to confront that Goliath one time, just like what we have to confront the other Goliath, which is Obama. We have to defeat them. We have to, if we're going to be successful long term. And this is the time frame to do it. As the waves coming down, the people that are left are looking for leadership. And sadly, a lot of them are going to be gobbled up with the Black Lives Matter movement. A lot of them are going to be gobbled up by the platitudes of Obama, who will come through and undermine our further struggle in his usual and predictable way, and other competitors simply trying to be opportunistic during this time. That's our competitive field. But I believe because we stand on truth, data, and our square, we can defeat them.
All right. Well, we don't need a celebrity to meet with him. We need our economists. We need our politicians. We need our great minds to meet with Trump, because we know that he lacks information and knowledge. So we need somebody to go there to give it to him, and it has to be done. And then it's not about whether you like him or not, whether he's racist, not. We don't like him and he is a racist. We have to meet with him. And
we have to confront and or have talks with all dimensions of white domination racism. So that does include the president. It also includes McConnell. It also includes Nancy Pelosi, who is also operating in not in our interest. And that's another thing we have to wake up about and get focused on.
I just hope that it's not same old, that somebody recognizes that we are in a cycle, in our protest cycle, and decides to step up and meet with, whether it's locally, you got to meet with your chief of police, whether it's, nationally, and someone got to go meet with Trump. We're in a cycle. It's down cycle. It's time to step up, stand up, and work with people who really don't have your best interest in mind based on their policies, but also don't want you to burn down their stuff.
Locally, we have confronted our misleadership class recently with our own press release, yet we are also smart and tactically trying to vie for being a part of the committee they want to set up. That's the next phase after this phase we're in. A committee is usually set up and it's ultimately used to divert, but we have a choice in that. We can become a part of the committee at the same time criticizing the committee, especially when it does not do our bidding. Mm-hmm. And so that's what we have failed to consistently do when past committees on the national level were set up, which came on with all kinds of recommendations, even told us what we wanted to hear because it was correct things we wanted to hear. But there was no enforcement, no follow through. So here we have another opportunity to not only in this phase gather like-minded individuals on our team as well as allies outside our team, but that can cooperate with us to make effective change and put pressures to bear on this committee phase, the coming phase, to address these issues, as well as be willing to remain in the streets. And I'm not talking about just the issues of complaining and protest. I'm saying in the streets in terms of something we've got to do locally and nationally. Be able to appeal to and directly service the needs of our people as best we can because of the suffering they're going through now. We have to get to that next phase, and that's a phase that the Black Panther Party got to, which made them a danger to the system. Right now, we're technically not a danger to the system, And that is the next phase we got to go to if we really want to make a difference in terms of long-term change. We've got to appeal to our base by providing for their needs as best we can. Catch the fire. If you're ADOS, an ally or friend, we encourage you to connect with a local ADOS chapter and help change your local politics. Our ADOS Ohio chapter in Columbus meets every fourth Sunday of the month. For more information on the time and location, visit adoscolumbus.org. You can also get more information on the ADOS movement, our politics, and the agenda. Please visit ados101.com.
If you have any announcements that you would like to add to our Catch the Fire segment, please let us know by emailing us at listeners@articlesofados.com. And this could be anything from an event or an issue that you would like to publicize.
Are you busy? Is the news coming so fast you can barely keep up? No worries. The Articles of ADOS podcast is here to help. Hit the subscribe button wherever you're listening right now, and we'll make sure you stay up to date on the news and information that affects you and your ADOS life. In today's Rapid News Reports, we have some articles that you may have missed, all in some way affect you and your ADOS life. Up first, we have
When the looting starts, the shooting starts. Behind the infamous phrase used by Trump. From the publication The New York Post, from the writer Leah Osterwich. The phrase "when the looting starts, the shooting starts," tweeted by President Trump, accused of glorifying violence, dates back to race riots during the 1960s, according to reports. It was used by Miami Police Chief Walter Hetley in 1967, and again the following year by segregationist presidential candidate George Wallace, NPR reported Friday. Hetley had been discussing his department's crackdown on slum hoodlums in Miami, which he claimed hadn't been affected by civil unrest because the message filtered down. When the looting starts, the shooting starts. The comment, which appeared in a United Press International story in December 1967, drew criticism from civil rights leaders at the time. Clarence Lucen, a professor at Howard University, told NPR that Hetley, who was white, had a long history of bigotry against the black community. The NAACP and other black organizations had for years complained about the treatment of the black community by Miami police, Lucen said. At this hearing, in discussing how he would deal with what he called a crime and thugs and threats by young black people, he issued this statement that the reason Miami had not had any riots up to that point was because of the message he had sent out that when the looting starts, the shooting starts. Hetley, the police chief for 20 years, said his Get Tough policy targeted young hoodlums from 15 to 21 who have taken advantage of the civil rights campaign. "We don't mind being accused of police brutality," he said at a 1967 press conference. His use of the phrase is believed to have intensified Miami's race riots in the late 60s, according to the Washington Post. I graded this article a good. I also believe Trump knew exactly what he was insinuating when he resurrected this phrase. And two, like in the 1960s, it had no effect on the protests because the next day there were still protests, there were still looting, and there were still buildings on fire. Empty threats meant nothing. Up next,
from the publication Inverse, entitled Doctors Clarify Why Racism Against Black Americans is a Public Health Crisis, from the writer Ali Patilio. As protests continue across the United States in response to the killings of Black Americans by police, would-be protesters are confronted with a question. Do they head to the streets, or do they continue to socially distance as the COVID-19 pandemic continues? On Twitter, some health specialists aired their take. COVID-19 is a public health emergency, and so is racism. Because of that, they support people's choice to go protest, even during a pandemic. They just hope that protesters do so safely. Wisdom Powell, a psychology professor at the University of Connecticut who has studied population health disparities, puts it this way. There is substantial evidence to suggest and to affirm that racism is a public health problem, Powell tells Inverse. COVID-19 and the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and others have brought this idea into the mainstream understanding, Powell explains. But the idea that racism is a public health issue is not a new idea. We have always known that racism is a public health problem because it lives in the structures of our society, in the policies and procedures that we've enacted, Powell says. It lives in transactions with physicians and patients, and it lives in transactions with physicians and patients, and it lives in clinical decision making. It is impossible to imagine that we wouldn't declare racism as a public health problem. About 66% of Black people report high levels of day-to-day racial discrimination, which can trigger the flight or fight response. These frequent potential traumatic events influence a person's allostatic load, research shows. This is a physiological indication of repeated or chronic stresses, wear and tear on the body. Black women and men have higher allostatic loads than their white counterparts, which contributes to early health deterioration and shorter lifespans. Researchers call this disturbing health phenomenon weathering, the result of cumulative exposure to social and economic adversity and political marginalization. Experiences with trauma or potentially traumatic events can wreak havoc on mental and emotional health and overwhelm people's coping abilities, Powell says. I grade this fair. Poor because white domination racist institutions such as the American Psychology Association has long resisted calls making racism a diagnosable disorder. Good because the article affirms what we should already know when we attempt solutions. For instance, seeing Black ADOS issues as solely police brutality or homelessness misses the problem. And next,
BET founder Robert Johnson calls for $14 trillion in reparations for slavery. From the publication Black Enterprise, writer Derek Major. Black Entertainment Television co-founder Robert Johnson told CNBC Monday the U.S. government should provide $14 trillion of reparations for slavery to help reduce racial inequality. According to CNBC, Johnson believes the wealth divide and police brutality against blacks are the heart of protests against police brutality and the death of George Floyd. Now is the time to go big, to keep America from dividing into two separate and unequal societies, Johnson said on Squawk Box. Wealth transfer is what's needed, Johnson added. Think about this. Since 200 plus years or so of slavery, labor taken with no compensation is a wealth transfer. Denial of access to education, which is a primary driver of accumulation of income and wealth, is a wealth transfer. Johnson, 74, became the first black billionaire in 2001 when he sold BET to Viacom. Soon after, he started the investment firm, the RLJ Companies. Johnson called reparation the affirmative action program of all time, saying it was signaled that white Americans acknowledge damages that are owed for the unequal playing field created by slavery. I graded this article an okay. Black Enterprise, I'm pretty sure, is aware of ADOS drumbeat for reparations, but it's not until Millionaire said something did they pick it up. I don't recall any Black Enterprise articles in recent months, weeks, that called for reparations. Why would Black Enterprise wait to address this issue with the black community, with the ADOS community? This article is just okay. And late.
Very good. I like that.
Up next,
from the publication, The Washington Post, entitled White Instigators to Blame for Mayhem in Some Protest, Local Officials Say. Writer Isaac Stanley Becker. What did I tell you? A voice cried out as the camera recording mayhem in downtown Pittsburgh settled on a white man, clad in all black, smashing the windows of a police vehicle. It is not black people, the onlooker called to the crowd before addressing the vandal directly. What are you doing? What he was doing, authorities later alleged, was inciting riots on Saturday as the city, like dozens of others across America, was swept up in sustained unrest over the death of a black man in police custody. Demonstrations have spread from Minneapolis, where a white police officer pinned his knee on the neck of George Floyd, to scores of cities, some of which have been looted and set ablaze. Police identified Brian Jordan Bartels, 20, of Allison Park, Pennsylvania, as having kicked off the escalation in Pittsburgh, one of several examples of peaceful assemblies against police violence creating opportunities for pandemonium. While at heart the gatherings have been an appeal for racial justice, They also have attracted a diverse array of people with other grievances and agendas who have co-opted the movement, accelerating what has been a national unraveling as the country reels from a pandemic that has put more than 40 million people out of work. In most American cities, people of all races appear to be participating in the violence, vandalism, and looting, particularly in Minneapolis, where a crowd burned the police department's 3rd precinct building last week, and vandals were seen smashing windows and stealing items from stores. Multiracial coalitions also have marched peacefully, but in some cities, local officials have noted that black protesters have struggled to maintain peaceful protest in the face of young white men joining the fray, seemingly determined to commit mayhem. I grade this good. And next?
Black Americans have a message for Democrats. Not being Trump is not enough. Tagline: Joe Biden wants to heal the soul of the country in this moment of protest and loss and win the White House. Simply telling people to vote in November may not help with either goal. From the publication The New York Times, and the writer Astrid Herndon, Columbia, South Carolina. In an on-camera address after a week of destructive protests, former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr. pleaded with his audience to imagine life for black people in America. Imagine, he said, if every time your husband or son, wife or daughter left the house, you feared for their safety. Imagine the police called on you for sitting in Starbucks. The anger and frustration and the exhaustion, it's undeniable, he said. Exhaustion. For many black Americans across the country, what a year this month has been. The coronavirus pandemic has continued to disproportionately kill black people, and a spat of high-profile killings in recent months in Georgia, Kentucky, and Minnesota, the latter two at the hands of the police, led to widespread demonstrations nationwide. Protests shook more than 36 cities on Saturday as crowds expressed outrage over the death of George Floyd, a black security guard who was killed in police custody in Minneapolis. Demonstrators shut down freeways, set fires, and battled police batons and tear gas, the pain and frustration of the moment spilling out into the streets. I'm tired of coming out here, said Devin Moon, a 21-year-old Columbia resident, one of hundreds who participated in the peaceful protest in the city. I'm tired of feeling forced to do all this. It dawned on Sierra Moore, 24, who attended the protest, carrying a homemade sign that read, "No justice, no peace," that she and her grandmother have been protesting the same issues over the course of a century. She looked at the racially diverse group of thousands which gathered for a short program on the State House steps before leading a march to the local police station. Next to her was another sign, "Respect my existence or expect my resistance." I just don't think that's how change happens, Ms. Moore said of voting. They've been telling us to do that for so long, and we've done it. And look at everything that's still going on. I graded this article a good. I think it would be a great read and a great understanding of why voting is not the only solution to our issues. Up next,
from the publication Community Independent Journal, entitled Leading Scholar Ibram Kendi, Education and Love Will Not Solve Racism, by the author Dwayne Townsend. We have been taught that ignorance and hate lead to racist ideas, lead to racist policies, Kendi said. If the fundamental problem is ignorance and hate, then your solutions are going to be focused on education and love and persuasion. But of course, stamped from the beginning, shows that the actual foundation of racism is not ignorance and hate, but self-interest, particularly economic and political and cultural. Self-interest drives racist policies that benefit that self-interest. When the policies are challenged because they produced inequalities, racist ideas spring up to justify those policies. Hate flows freely from there. We can understand this very simply with slavery. I'm enslaving people because I want to make money. Abolitionists are resisting me. So I'm going to convince Americans that these people should be enslaved because they're black. And then people will start believing those ideas. That these people are so barbaric that they need to be enslaved, or that they are so childlike that they need to be enslaved. Kendi boils racist ideas down to an irreducible core. Any idea that suggests one racial group is superior or inferior to another group in any way is a racist idea, he says, and there are two types: Segregationist ideas contend racial groups are created unequal. Assimilationist ideas, as Kendi defines them, argue that both discrimination and problematic black people are to blame for inequalities. The actual foundation of racism is not ignorance and hate, but self-interest. Americans who don't carry tiki torches react viscerally to segregationist ideas like those on display at the white nationalist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, that left one young counter-protester dead. Assimilationist ideas are more subtle, seductive, and coded. You can be someone who has no intention to be racist, who believes in and fights for equality. But because you're conditioned in a world that is racist and a country that is structured in anti-black racism, you yourself can perpetuate those ideas, says Kendi, no matter what color you are. Anti-racist ideas hold that racial groups are equal, that the only thing inferior about black people is their opportunities. The only thing wrong with black people is that we think there is something wrong with black people, a line that Kendi uses like a mantra. I grade this piece good, fair, in that the professor's definition of white domination racism is too broad. Excellent in like other academic work that gets little to no press coverage, this article clearly shows that talking or dealing with white domination racism cannot and is meant to never be dealt with when referring to these behaviors in simplistic terms such as hate. And next.
Say Their Name Cemetery in Minneapolis memorizes Black Americans killed by police. Publication is a news report from KTSP, and the news reporter is Richard Reed. In an open green space off of 37th Street in South Minneapolis, a unique memorial has appeared. It's called the Say Their Name Cemetery. Each of the 100 graves is inscribed with the name of an African American who was killed by law enforcement. Hopefully, this is a wake-up call between what we've been seeing around the city, around the country, and the world, says David Smith, who wanted to see the memorial himself. Anna Barber and Connor Wright, two University of Pennsylvania graduates, say they were shocked by the death of George Floyd, who died while former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin was kneeling on his neck. They decided to create signs cut in the shape of tombstones with the names of each victim prominently displayed. In front, decorated with flowers, is a marker for Floyd. It's not a physical representation in the flesh, but now that you can put a name to a marker and see, oh wow, Smith said, hopefully it turns the light bulb on for people to start paying attention and figuring out, what can I do as a citizen? No matter what my race is, no matter your social economic status, what can I do to make things better? I graded this as fair. I feel that the gesture is met with good intentions, but also symbolism still is not policy, does not change the lives of those ADOS people that were killed and or their families' lives.
From the publication The Guardian, entitled, In 1919, the state failed to protect Black Americans. A century later, it's still failing. Tagline, there is something so wounded in American society that basic commitment to justice is not part of the operating code. By the writer, Professor Carol Anderson. In 1919, as soldiers returned from the First World War, many white Americans saw African American men in military uniforms for the first time. That sight and the challenge it posed to the political, social, and economic order was deeply threatening to them. Groups of armed white men hunted down and slaughtered hundreds of Black Americans across the country. The wave of lynchings and race riots came to be known as the Red Summer. The Black community did its best to fight back without protection from the state. In some cases, police actively participated in the lynchings. The U.S. Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, claimed that left-wing radicals were behind the uprisings, a false charge and one that further endangered African American lives. Palmer worked for President Woodrow Wilson, an ardent segregationist who screened Birth of a Nation in the White House and praised the Ku Klux Klan even as it deployed terrorism to keep blacks away from the voting booth. Wilson had been silent. While whites slaughtered African Americans in East St. Louis in 1917, and he did little to nothing in 1919 when they again attacked and killed Black people, this time on an even more horrific and grisly scale. When African Americans fought back when they protested, when they made clear they would not quietly accept the destruction of their lives, Palmer mobilized the power of the federal government to brand black unrest as the work of the enemy of the state, communists. It was his version of peace without justice. To do this, he ignored the destructive and violent white supremacy that his president had helped unleash. He remained unconcerned about the bold, brazen killing of black people. And he had no qualms about a criminal justice system in which being black meant the presumption of guilt. More than 100 years later, in the wake of the brutal, merciless killings of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, not to mention an incident in which a white woman attempted to put a black bird watcher in the crosshairs of the NYPD, our current Attorney General, Bill Barr, does not appear to see injustice. Instead, he sounds much like his ancient predecessor, A. Mitchell Palmer. Barr, like Palmer, has largely ignored the continued killing of black people by vigilantes and agents of the state. He has also ignored the root causes of the current uprisings, such as the flat-out refusal of American institutions to address the violence and conditions that create a life where black people cannot breathe. Instead, Barr has chosen to focus his attention on what he characterizes as rioting and domestic terrorism, mimicking Donald Trump, and without evidence, he has blamed the current eruption on far-left extremists using Antifa-like tactics, many of whom travel from out of state to promote the violence. And he has warned that he will prosecute those mostly phantom anti-fascists. Barr previously said that if communities had the audacity to protect police brutality, they might find themselves without police protection they need. For his part, Trump has branded the protesters thugs and threatened to have American citizens shot and vicious dogs unleashed on them. On Sunday, he tweeted that Antifa would be labeled a terrorist organization. Strangely, Barr and Trump did not apply the same threat to the armed white men who stormed the Michigan Capitol, challenged law enforcement, and shut down the government during a pandemic. Trump defined these gun-toting white men as very good people. Despite all the smoke and mirrors and blustering threats, it's obvious what Trump's Department of Justice has done, or not done, that helped bring us to this horrific moment. It abandoned enforcing consent decrees with police departments that have a demonstrated history of brutality and discrimination. It refused to collect and monitor the data that would identify patterns and hotspots of bad policing so that safeguards could be put in place. Equally important, it didn't shore up the voting rights of American citizens so they could elect representatives whose policies could protect their lives. Instead, the Department of Justice lent its heft to conservative forces, like in Alabama, who were determined to block African Americans from the ballot box even during a pandemic. I grade this work excellent, absolutely excellent, and mirrors exactly what I had been saying in previous discussions on this topic, that we are just reliving and recycling the same old behavior dynamics. We must solve this now. And that's it for this week's Rapid News. All articles featured will be posted in our Facebook group and in the show notes on our website.
Time now for the main event.
In this week's main event, we will interview the article from the publication The Independent entitled Killer Mike, T.I., and Atlanta's Black Misleadership Class. Tagline: Some black celebrities are being used as pawns by politicians during the George Floyd protests, as we saw when the rappers appeared alongside Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms this week. Author Devin Springer. I will ask the questions. Lisa will give the answers. Welcome, Mr. Springer. Right from the tagline. I quote, "Some black celebrities are being used as pawns by politicians during the George Floyd protests, as we saw with the rappers appearing alongside Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms this week." End quote. Really scathing, Mr. Springer. Is it possible that you're being a bit harsh?
My dad is a union welder in Georgia with a wide, gummy smile and a head that was filled with gray hair before he left high school. I came to know the world through the passenger seat of my dad's car. He'd blast rapper T.I.'s Rubber Band Man through the speakers and we'd ride around town as his grayish black head bobbed to the beat. my bones rattling with the bass and treble. I was barely old enough to be on a computer, but I remember needing to hear more, and finding the lyrics to T.I.'s 2001 song, What Happened. On the song he raps, "Worked us and never paid us, killed Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and everybody else tried to come down here and save us. Kept our fathers from raising us, kidnapped us from our country, and took our traditions and religions away from us. Well, now it's time for the AK to bust." As a youth, the words hit me deeply because he called attention to violence committed against Black people and violence as a potential option in response to our oppression in a direct way. This weekend, as I watched T.I. share a stage with fellow rapper and landlord Killer Mike and Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, in an attempt to disparage the righteous Black rage in response to the police killing of George Floyd, I instantly knew we've entered a new era of Black sellouts that we must reckon with.
How so, Mr. Springer?
Following the police killings of several Black people, specifically George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Tony McDade, residents in dozens of major U.S. cities took to the streets to protest the latest acts of violence in a centuries-long war against Black people. In Atlanta, as the number of people protesting grew into thousands, reports of cop cars being burned and a few broken windows became the center of attention in both the media and Lance Bottom's Friday night press conference.
So you're saying from these coincidental chain of events that
T.I. referred to Atlanta as fictional country Wakanda, saying we don't do this here because Atlanta has been here for us. Killer Mike gave a more substantive, impassioned, but ultimately politically confused diatribe against police violence, then still deferred to pacification of Black rage through electoral solutions to a problem which has yet to be solved through a ballot box and is unlikely to be. We have to be better than this moment, Killer Mike said, while wearing a shirt which read, "Kill your masters," and teetering between tears and angst. We have to be better than burning down our own homes, because if we lose Atlanta, what else do we have? The city of Atlanta, along with the rest of the world, then witnessed an angry, seemingly disturbed mayor scolding the residents of her city as if we were her grandchildren. "What are you changing by tearing up a city?" she asked. "You've lost all credibility. This is not how we change America. This is not how we change the world."
Well, shouldn't respectable leadership encourage nonviolence and responsible behaviors during such unpredictable and dangerous events?
The entire spectacle was a mishmash of scolding, empty political sloganeering, tone-deaf pleas for peace in response to systemic state violence, and the treachery of the Black misleadership class. In his 2018 article, Black Agenda Report, executive editor Glenn Ford defines this class as both an actual and aspirational class of political forces, readily prepared to sell out the interests of the overwhelmingly working class Black masses for the sake of capitalist, corporate, or imperialist interests. While Killer Mike may genuinely care about Black people in Atlanta, one must also understand his class interests do not fundamentally align with the larger majority of Black people in the city. Even in his reference to protesters burning down our own homes, there is an irreconcilable tension which alludes to the either ill-informed or intentionally misleading nature of Killer Mike's words. When the "we" is meant to be Black people, then it must be made clear that most of us do not own this city, even if it was built by our forced labor in generations past. Data shows that despite representing roughly 33% of the Atlanta population, Black people are less than 25% of homeowners. In fact, Atlanta is amongst the worst cities in the U.S. in terms of home ownership disparities, has the worst income inequality as of 2018, and is suffering a gentrification boom which is throwing Black Atlantans further into economic crisis. If Black residents own little, yet make up the largest portion of the workforce, are they burning down their own homes, or are they burning down a plantation?
Very incendiary rhetoric, Mr. Springer. Come on now, are you not being a bit hyperbolic?
According to Asia Parks, an Atlanta lawyer and activist, and I quote, The protests are a pent-up frustration not only with police brutality, but with economic instability that has been bubbling since the last recession, and it is now collapsing due to the pandemic. Millions of people are unemployed and are not receiving unemployment checks. We received a stimulus check for $1,200 to last 3 months, while essential workers are risking their lives for minimum wage, and rent is still due, she said. It is obvious that Killer Mike is not in meaningful conversation with local grassroots organizers who have spent several years trying to bring attention to correct these racist, systemic injustices. Atlanta's Housing Justice League, a coalition of Atlanta residents taking action against the violence of gentrification of multiple historically black neighborhoods, has hosted public forums, teach-ins, protests, and demonstrations, and even occupied a major section of downtown for several weeks to bring attention to these issues, which are all intricately connected to police violence.
Okay, Mr. Springer. I definitely see and understand your concern. Yet you are making it seem as though these leaders are intentionally getting things wrong. Isn't it possible, from your view, that they may be missing on the specifics, but generally their intentions are in the right place?
T.I. boldly proclaimed that when you don't get treated right in other cities, Atlanta has been here for us. But if Atlanta has been here for us, why are Atlanta police officers still responsible for multiple instances of violence and killings of black people? What safe haven are these rappers referring to when still no recourse has been given for the 2015 death of Anthony Hill, who was completely naked and experiencing a mental health episode when he was shot twice in the chest by Officer Robert Olson? Nor for the police murders of Alexia Christian, Nicholas Thomas, Oscar Kane, and many others. Atlanta is not the fictional city of Wakanda, but a real city filled with real black people steeped in real death.
Yes, perhaps T.I. was a bit out there on that one. I grant you that, but overall, they were still making a good case for the direction Atlanta should be heading in these troubled times, don't you think?
As these rappers talked down to protesters who were waiting in righteous anger, following lifelong state brutality, none of these names arose, no truth was spoken to power, and the majority of attention was thrust onto damaged property.
Yet, according to you, rappers are not the only ones getting things wrong, right?
Mayor Bottom stated sternly, and I quote, "This is not in the spirit of Martin Luther King Jr. This is chaos. A protest has purpose. When Dr. King was assassinated, we didn't do this to our city. If you want change in America, go and register to vote. That is the change we need in this country."
Yeah, what's wrong with that?
The only problem is when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, roaring uprisings did break out in nearly 100 cities, including Atlanta. Moreover, King himself spoke straightforward about riots and uprisings, stating that they do not develop out of thin air, but rather are the inevitable result of injustice, state violence, and poor living conditions, which must be condemned as vigorously as we condemn riots.
Well, maybe she misspoke, or really, she has no intention to mislead people, I don't think.
Upon Dr. King's assassination, the Black Panther Party issued a statement which declared that although officials on all levels of government give public praise to the man and his deeds, they are all too silent in pledging themselves to the concrete actions that are needed to deal with the evils in American society, and that Dr. King dedicated his life to eliminating.
Well, I still think you're being a bit harsh, sir. In your view, hasn't entertainment or political leadership offered any workable solutions to these problems?
In the 6 years since Mike Brown was killed, Atlanta has repeatedly brought celebrities in to calm the outrage. In 2016, Mayor Kasim Reed invited Usher to a meeting that was meant to be for #ATL is Ready organizers, and no one knew why Usher was there. Parks tells me he told organizers outside that the mayor is trying hard and to calm down. Did they think the organizers would be enamored by his stardom? Eva Dickerson, an Atlanta community organizer, farmer, and teacher, tells me that they stand in full solidarity with the protesters who have damaged property because the violence is happening in the streets is being perpetrated by the state. The rioters have rocks in their voices. The state is using military-grade weapons on the youth, who are the majority of these protesters. Dickerson said that Killer Mike and T.I. have specifically been thorns in the sides of black grassroots organizers for some time now. They've let what little class status they've been able to obtain confuse them and have decided to align themselves with the oppressive class. Their role as agents of the oppressive class is to undermine, belittle, and complicate whatever steps working class and otherwise marginalized black people take to build power in and across our communities.
Why do you have to be so critical of our leaders who are just trying?
The existence of such a misleadership class is not new, and as many before me have noted, is actually necessary for the perpetuation of the capitalist system. In his magnum opus, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, Guyanese historian Rotter Rodney illustrates how colonial forces across African societies gave meager power to select members of society in order to stratify the classes and for them to act as padding between the masses and their colonial rulers. Rodney writes that the presence of a group of African sellouts is part of the definition of underdevelopment, inextricably connecting this group to the economic pillaging of black communities. Martin Quinnes, psychiatrist and revolutionary Frantz Fanon, explains that this group is given the role of an intermediary group whose task is not to transform the nation, but prosaically serve as a conveyor belt for capitalism.
Now, come on. Former President Obama says we shouldn't be thinking about doing anything too revolutionary.
T. Troutman, an urban studies researcher and community organizer with Atlanta's Justice for All Coalition, tells me that many in the black entertainment industry do not plug in with grassroots organizations doing this work, but are typically deployed as a means of issuing the rules and expectations, or in this case, call for law and order or peace in the event of uprisings. Troutman says that at least since the 1996 Atlanta Olympics, the city has tried to put up a veneer of equality and a positive race relations to maintain its mythical description as the Black Mecca, often at the opposition of the residents' demand.
Come on now. I'm sure our listeners would agree with me that you are being a bit too conspiratorial.
After decades of struggle, local coalitions primarily composed of formerly incarcerated women of color successfully forced Mayor Bottoms to end Atlanta Police cooperation with ICE and to formally shut down the Atlanta City Detention Center. This would not have happened without the tireless work of local activists, organizers, cultural workers, who all came together to pressure the local government to do so through a multitude of tactics. During this time, rappers like T.I. and Killer Mike were nowhere to be found, and Mayor Bottoms would not have taken these actions without her hand being forced by dedicated locals.
Well, there you go. See, sometimes the people just have to push our leaders to do the right things. Makes perfect sense to me.
So why now, in the midst of a tension that is the combination of centuries of state violence, dispossession, and the Atlanta way not working, a tension which feels increasingly irreconcilable and undoubtedly pivotal, do Killer Mike and T.I. have so much to say about peace? It's likely that on a personal level, they genuinely care about these issues.
Now, I agree with that.
But their class interests have evolved into a place which puts them at opposition with their very fans who catapulted their careers forward. Those class interests have also blinded them to the reality that they are used as pawns by the political class to sustain the very system which their music critiques. While they were profiting from illustrating and vocalizing life in the trap they came from, those still inside the trap continue to perish at the hands of their government and its actors. As the masses continue to mobilize and revolutionary spirit grows, many of our favorite rappers, actors, and artists will continue to expose themselves and their allegiances. Are we ready to listen to the voice of the people and to stop getting our politics from celebrities?
I have to admit you've made some fairly good points. If we had more time, I'm sure I could come up with something wrong with what you're saying, but however, we must be going. Well, that completes this interview. Listeners, you can read this full article on our website in this week's show notes. Coming up, we have the commentary on this article. Did we like it? Did we hate it? Stay tuned.
We want to take the time to give our friends and listeners a shout out. Thank you for clicking that subscribe button and for liking and sharing the podcast. You can also continue supporting the show by joining our Patreon. where you can receive exclusive content and promotional items for as little as $3 a month. Sponsoring the show will ensure that we can continue to bring you the news and information important to your ADOS life. So head on over and join us at patreon.com/articles of ADOS. All right, what do we think of this article?
I enjoyed playing the Obama apologist. I think it was needed to emphasize the points that the writer here was making, Mr. Springer was making, which were absolutely excellent.
Yeah, this was one of those articles I suggested because I thought it would help people see what Tone and Yvette have already tried to warn us about, and that is that celebrities are being used to mask our failures, number one, and two, stop our progress for our fight for reparations in the Black agenda, and obviously stop our anger and angst during a protest. So they're being used to, and I agree with the writer, they're being used to stop the very people in the trap that they used to rap about. I think they're acting up. I think they're out here just saying stuff, and they don't, as Tom would say, they don't know enough about the average ADOS life, out here. And I don't even think they rap about it anymore. T.I. doesn't rap as much as he used to because he's probably far removed. This even goes with Jay-Z. He don't rap too much about what's going on in the streets as much as he rap about capitalism now. You can see a switch in a lot of these rappers' messages and music. They're no longer rapping about ADOS life. They're rapping about businesses and capitalism and being what's better than one billionaire too. So they're in a different class now. I don't even think they realize they're in a different class. I don't think they even recognize that they do not relate to the average Black man on a corner. You nodding as you ride by in your Bentley to the guy on the corner and they nod back. That's not a connection. That's not knowing what his life is like. So they're misleading, and they're working with these leaders that really don't have any intention of doing nothing but pacifying. And the only time they do anything, like the article suggested, is when their hands get twisted. Her hands got twisted in closing down that center, that detention center. And so when her hands got tied and she had to do something because the voices were too loud in that situation. That's the only time they do something. So be on the side where the people with the voices are getting too loud, not on the side with the people that wants to quiet those voices. They're on the wrong side, and I don't think they know it.
Connecting this to what I said earlier about Professor Carol Anderson's piece, while she wisely is connecting the dots between what happened 100 years ago and what's happening today. It's the same dynamic, same behavioral dynamic amongst the same players of institutions, all the way to people in the streets. So what did I say about 2 episodes ago? That the elites have developed the means of counter-insurgency programming that undermines what it took to make the civil rights movement a success. There were the political leaders that could effectively and sometimes even marginally, but ultimately affect positively our political needs. At the same time, there was the entertainment sector that provided funds and advocacy for our best results. What have they done since then? Well, they learned from that. They have effectively, and I said this officially in the possible yellow journalism of Zygmunt Brzezinski's memorandum 46, where he said that specifically they would coach or manage Black political officials to be the face of their interests, while the face symbolically meant that it would represent to us representation, when in fact they were obligated to fulfill the ends of white elites. Well, they also have done the same thing with the entertainment industry in very many ways. One was to eradicate it by taking it out of public schools, meant that people weren't exposed to music, which is essential for learning. People weren't exposed to ideas of what they could do with music, therefore becoming entertainers. What did they do? They first rejected as a body the issue of rap because it was too radical, because they were speaking more closely to our experience, but also offering solutions such as cultural solutions, as well as what we could do to change the system. What did it do? It helped to morph that creative genius that came from us into something more manageable and applicable for the white domination racist capitalist machine. And so you have rappers that popularize everything from party going all the way to billionaires like Trump, as they were doing in the 80s. And what did that help to do? Help to further fashion what blaxploitation movies had done in the 70s that music and rap was doing in the 80s, making people conditioned that all we have to do is work harder and fight harder to make it in this American capitalist system. And it was alive then, and it still remains alive today. So who's being thrusted forward after Sony and other major entertainment execs further fashion rap music to go beyond its life cycle? Life cycle standards are roughly 20 to 30 years. Jazz, R&B, what have you. What we should have had in the 90s was the resurrection of neo soul. It was squashed because people that were in control of the industry maintained rap to go beyond its life cycle. So because it was so useful and effective in deranging black minds and black lives. And that's why it's continued. So who are being picked to be some of these people that thrust forward? I praise Killer Mike when he's on points with some of our objectives as ADOS people. So he has been a very good ally. But here is clearly he's bowing ultimately to his class interest in preserving the city and what it's doing, while T.I. is proclaiming that it's Wakanda in all silly, immature fashion. We can identify those who are cooperating with those who wish to oppress us. We have to be definite and mature in realizing while they entertain us in our youth and our adult and as a part of our adult citizen responsibilities, we must check them.
Amen.
Da-da-da.
And I just want to end on this because Yvette and Tone get a lot of slack for going after celebrities when they are really giving misinformation, when they are masking our failure, when they are speaking about something that is against what we are standing for. And a lot like the interviewer here, apologizing, they get a lot of give the celebrities a chance. They could be good allies. Those that are good allies show themselves. Those celebrities that are just not for working with the oppressor, they show themselves. Those that recognize their privilege in class now that they have quote unquote made it, they show themselves. So if T.I., if Killer Mike, or whoever, Kevin Hart, Jay-Z, whoever, they show themselves in what they are about. It is not Tone or Yvette's fault if they are recognizing, or Diddy is another one, if they're not recognizing that they are using their platforms wrong and you can use it better to amplify our voices and not the oppressor's voice. With that said, that completes this interview. Listeners, you can read this full article on our website in this week's show notes.
This week in hashtag ADOS, we want to share some of our favorite tweets. Up first,
from the Queen of LA. Remember when everyone called ADOS crazy for advocating for reparations? Well, today I heard the mayor of LA publicly calling for reparations for the descendants of American slaves. Who's crazy now?
From Chad _Boogie, aka Not Your Negro, hashtag ADOS. The co-opt of Black American struggle is coming from all angles. Grifters, gatekeepers still fail to realize hashtag ADOS will continue the hashtag reparations now drumbeat as long as it takes. We are stronger, more resolute than you. We fight for each other, for survival, and we will win.
For Magic Marguerite, aka Critical Side-Eye. No cause for reparation, just a repetitive, monotonous Black Lives Matter, and no justice, no peace, into the abyss. Black people need reparations now. That would resolve 95% of our economic, education, and social issues, including police brutality. Hashtag ADOS.
From Max HPF Maxwell Little. What happens when the police beat a black person on Black Lives Matter street? Let me know when the movement gears toward demanding real structural policy changes that will alter inequality for Native Black Americans. Hashtag reparations. Hashtag ADOS.
And lastly, from Jamil Akil, do yourself a favor. Ignore everything that former President Barack Obama has to say right now. This man had 8 years to effect serious change, to advocate for reparations, and he didn't do it. This is not his moment. It's ours. Hashtag ADOS.
Amen.
All right. There you have it, family. Another week, another show. Thanks for joining us on the Articles of ADOS podcast. Make sure to visit our website, articlesofados.com, where you can join our mailing list, see the show notes for today's episode, and to leave us a voice message to be featured on the show.
Now that you're family, we'd love it if you'd like our Facebook page and join our private Articles of ADOS group. This is where you can connect with other listeners, give feedback, and share articles you would like us to discuss. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, send us an email to listeners@articlesofados.com.
Be sure to tune in next Thursday for a new episode of Undiscussed News you may have missed. And join us live for great content and conversation Sundays at 8 p.m. on YouTube, Twitch, Periscope, and in our Facebook group, where we recap and discuss this week's episode. Until next time, family, stay safe, stay strong. Peace.